How's it going tonight, everybody? This is the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. I'm Ryan Thomas. Welcome once again to another edition of the Thomas Take. Very exciting stuff today on today's show. Excuse me. Bringing you a late edition of the Thomas Take. Was supposed to be on at 9 today, but had some other commitments to focus on. Some other developments that I will be announcing on the show in the coming weeks. But tonight is a night that I have been waiting for quite some time. A night that I never thought would actually become reality. Tonight is a night where I'm going to talk about UFC 210, the long-rumored event, April 8th, coming to Buffalo, New York. It was rumored it would be UFC 211, but one of the UFC fight nights was canceled, and it was never replaced. So there's one less event on the UFC's chronological order calendar, so to speak. And that is UFC 210. During the UFC fight night, Yair Rodriguez versus BJ Penn was the main event on Sunday. John Anik announced on the UFC broadcast that UFC would be returning to Buffalo, New York for the first time since 1995. Which dates all the way back to UFC 7, where Ken Shamrock was the main event fighter of the night, fought Oleg. I'm not even going to pronounce his name because I'll butcher it, but it was a long time ago, to say the least. And the sport has completely taken on life of its own. It's completely different from that time period. Brief history lesson, 1995, as I said, was the last event in Buffalo. It was at the Memorial Auditorium, which is now demolished. It was the old home of the Buffalo Sabres. And the sport was then basically banned from New York State. The New York State Athletic Commission took a vote in 1996, decided that the sport was unsafe. The rules were too open. There was regulations were not a part of the sport at the time. There wasn't weight classes. There wasn't many rules. It was complete barbaric entertainment. And back in 2001, the parent company Zuffa bought the UFC from Bob Meyerowitz, and they bought it for $2 million. The heads of that company were Lorenzo Fertitta and Frank Fertitta. And the third man in line was then UFC president Dana White. And what has ensued over the last 15 years under the Zuffa ownership has been the most meteoric rise of any sport in the world, in on planet Earth. I really believe that. And I believe that because I've seen it from the moment I first started watching the UFC and mixed martial arts to this very moment right now. It was a sport that had a completely different contrast. It was seen as cage fighting. It was seen as, the cage door locks, brutality, the aggression, the dangerous nature of the sport was really rung home. Now it is seen as mixed martial arts full of these premier kickboxers and premier wrestlers and premier Brazilian jiu-jitsu artists and judo practitioners, and that was a little bit of what it was back then, but now these are supreme athletes that can fight over a 25-minute span and probably, if they were allowed to, continue to fight thereafter. We have the Conor McGregors of the world, people that are brash and sell fights. Someone that is brash and sells fights. We have John Jones. We have Stipe Miocic. We have the bantamweight divisions. Dominic Cruz, Uriah Faber. Those guys paved the way for those younger weight classes. Cody Garbrandt. We have just so many supreme athletic fighters that are a huge contrast from the old nature of the sport back then when the UFC had its last event in Buffalo. A night and day difference. And it's truly amazing. It's something that I'm going to look back on and say, wow, I actually remember the landmark moments of the UFC where GSP fought in front of 55,000 people at the Rogers Center on my 19th birthday versus Jake Shields. It was the biggest, highest attendance event in UFC history. And that was a special moment. Obviously, that moment and the Madison Square Garden this past November, UFC 205. And when it was announced that the sport was finally made legal in New York State, when New York State came to a vote, the Athletic Commission came to a vote, the one guy that was the opponent of the UFC coming to New York State and mixed martial arts being fully sanctioned in New York State was Sheldon Silver, who was a New York State congressman, and he held political office for decades, climbed the political ladder, and was in the position to make the sort of one of the many people to make the judgment call on the UFC coming to New York State. And he voted no every single time. He was an old-timer, a boxing-type guy that thought that the UFC caused more injuries than boxing, when really it's the exact opposite. And it became known that he was a crooked politician, and he is now serving jail time, and is obviously no longer in the political position that he is in now. So without his influence on the New York State politicians, it became very easy for the UFC and for mixed martial arts to become legal in the state of New York. And that's what happened this past year. In 2016, I believe it was March of 2016, if I'm not mistaken, where it was finally announced that the UFC would be coming to New York. And I knew right away, one of the first things that I thought of was Buffalo, where I'm from, where I've lived my entire life, Western New York, my home. When would the UFC be coming to my home? Lorenzo Fertitta made a promise back in 2005 when the UFC was constantly badgered about New York State. New York State was like the sore thumb of the UFC, so to speak, the thorn in their side. Why would New York State not agree to this when 45 states had agreed to making mixed martial arts sanctioned and fully legal to hold events in their respective states? And it became 46, and it became 47, and it became 48, then it became 49. New York was the final state in the United States to legalize the sport and sanction it. And it was questioned to Dana White and to Lorenzo Fertitta for over a decade, and they had no answer. And when Lorenzo Fertitta was asked about it, he specifically said that he could guarantee that when it does happen, he had faith that it would happen, that when it does, he will hold 3 to 4 events within the first 6 months of the UFC coming to New York State. And although Lorenzo Fertitta is not the principal owner of the UFC, WME-IMG bought the company for $4.025 billion. Lorenzo Fertitta made good on his promise. That was something that he put in place before he sold the company, and it's something that the UFC has made do on. UFC 205, the first event to come to New York in quite some time, Madison Square Garden. Then you had the UFC Fight Night in Albany, and you had the UFC 208, which is coming to Brooklyn in February 8th, I believe, or February 11th. And then, February 11th, where they're putting a title fight on the line, an inaugural UFC women's featherweight title fight. Anderson Silva's on that card. That's in Brooklyn. And then you have UFC 210, which is in Buffalo. So that's 4 events in New York State within the first 6 months of the company being in existence, being fully sanctioned. That's amazing that they made do on their promise. And last but not least, out of those 4 locations is my hometown, my city, Buffalo, New York. I really can't describe how excited I was when I heard that news. I can't describe what it will be like for me to be in the arena that I've seen Dominic Hasek and Ryan Miller and Daniel Briere and Chris Jury and Maxim Afinogenov and all the countless Sabres players that I've seen play in that arena in KeyBank Center. it's changed names quite a few times. It's went from KeyBank Center to, from KeyBank Center to First Niagara Center to, not in that order, but it's changed quite a few times. It was Marine Midland Arena, then it was HSBC Arena, then it was First Niagara Center, and now it's KeyBank Center. But just to know that, I'll be looking down and seeing that octagon, it's truly amazing. And I've waited for this moment for quite a long time. I would say probably 10 years plus, and probably around 15 years. And most people are excited. There's a lot of new casual fans in the sport due to the influences that the women's division have had on the new fan base, and due to guys like Conor McGregor, and there's new attractions within the UFC. And most people don't really know the journey that the UFC has had to go on and had to embark on in order to make this sport legal, in order for this event to happen. So this was my brief history lesson on the UFC returning to New York. I posted a podcast, one of the first editions of the Thomas Take Sports podcast, where I talked about the UFC being sanctioned in New York, why it has taken this long. And I made a lot of great points. This was before it was obviously legal in New York State. And it was the number one Thomas Take episode for over a year. And I'm very happy to, for almost a year, I'm very happy to announce that hopefully this one will be one of the best ones as well. So with that being said, my UFC 210 Buffalo, UFC Buffalo 210 mock card will be released coming up right after the brief break here. That was the brief history lesson on what brought the UFC to Buffalo. I'll be back with my UFC dream card, the card that I think makes the most sense for the UFC and for Buffalo. Stay tuned.